Our Generation Gap videos aim to uncover specific needs and highlight possible actions to help plan and achieve future financial goals, dependent on the age group you fall into. In this Generation Gap video, we're going to take a look at Generation X. Born between 1965 and 1980, so they're currently in their mid-40s to late 50s. They might be getting ready to look at downsizing, possibly early retirement. They might be looking to future financial security, pinched by having to support aging parents and children desperate for a leg up onto the property ladder. This generation started the interesting coffee. You might say they were pioneers, but not be too impressed with what they thought was the height of sophistication in a restaurant, ordering a cappuccino. The dance move you either love or hate, which is associated with Gen X, is the Macarena.
Shouldn't financial matters all be in hand for Generation X, being middle-aged and settled? Does research suggest otherwise? If you're in the middle-aged bracket of mid-40s to late 50s, what should you be thinking about when it comes to budgeting and planning?
Budgeting and planning for Generation X should be well advanced. It very rarely is, but actually there's still time to identify the priorities. What are your personal priorities? And for some people it will be, I want to retire at 55, because actually it's the quality of time I spend with my family and whatever. Now that's fine, how do we make it happen? So they should have a very good grip and handle on exactly what their benefits are, what their priorities are. Then depending obviously on kids and the age of those children in terms of what financial support they need. We talked earlier about deposits for property. It's pretty common these days for parents to assist where they can with accommodation costs at university. It doesn't seem to be quite as common these days for the kids to go to university and think that's it. It's everybody, well, not everybody, that's a generalisation. A lot of families I speak to now, it seems to be common for the master's overlay as well, and it might not necessarily be in the UK, so there's an awful lot of extra cost. And what I'd say, coming back to the budgeting piece, is let's budget for the unknowns and just say, actually, experience tells us that we need this extra cash pot for the kids that still want to come on holiday with us, because we're going to some nice locations even though the kids are in their early 20s. So I think we have to be aware, if we're going to encourage that sort of behaviour from our kids, that we have got the cash to do so. But also encourage them to stand on their own 2 feet. And the bank of mum and dad cannot be open forever.
On that particular point, Stuart, in the bank of mum and dad, property is a key point, I think, for Gen X. A big decision with property matters for this generation is upsize or downsize, because there are a number of individuals in that age group who are actually late parents and find themselves with teenagers at a later age and having to find accommodation for them. Or equally, they've flown the nest and they're now having to accommodate, or maybe they're having to accommodate elderly parents. So at both ends of the spectrum. So in that mix, that conundrum of various different family shapes, what possible advice and guidance might you give to somebody for determining which way to go in terms of their property, and certainly in terms of how they can look after the situations that face having to care for elderly parents?
The property question is significant for Generation X. Hopefully they've been reducing their mortgage where finances allow. But also they're starting to think whether they will continue with a mortgage. And I appreciate the rules currently in the UK are, once you get to age 70, the mortgage has to be repaid, whereas some people would like to use them tactically for tax planning reasons. So there's still some uncertainties that the Generation Xers have got to plan for, hence why amassing this cash to allocate, to support, to repay the mortgage, to support the kids, I think is really important. In terms of the question on parents as well, I think they've probably got parents who are silent generation in terms of age profile, and I'm seeing more and more clients in their 70s and 80s who are in the the family property there, therefore they were in 20 or 30 years and should have downsized earlier, but will not do, understandably, for emotional reasons. And I therefore think that Generation X have seen that playing out with their parents, and therefore, through their own experiences, are trying to take steps to avoid that. And that might be part of the financial cascade which helps the kids get on the property ladder, helps the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs, because without it, staying in a 5-bed detached family property, if that's what you'd be fortunate enough to live in, when there's just the two of you, does not make an awful lot of sense if you're thinking about the next generation. And I think we need to think from a community perspective more about that, or the distance between the grandparents and grandchildren in respect to property will be almost impossible for a lot of families to bridge that gap. So I see a lot of 40-year-olds, early 50-year-olds, and therefore it's part of the retirement conversation, because quite clearly if you're going to help your kids, by definition it will impact on yourselves. So, and we encourage those conversations because they're very personal. If somebody wants to retire in 55, that's fine. What does that mean for them? What income do they need? What support to their children do they need? What part does their property play in that? If they've been fortunate to have a second property on a buy-to-let basis, is the income, as it has been potentially for mum and dad, does that start getting redirected now to children? All conversations and topics that we need to embrace. And a really good time to do it where finance is involved, where there's mortgages involved. We're not mortgage brokers, but we work very closely with mortgage brokers.
Is there a real risk with this generation that they end up supporting both ends of the family spectrum and leave very little for themselves to actually enjoy their hard work?
I think there's a very grave risk that Generation X try to help everybody and support everybody, and they're parenting up and down. So they're parenting their parents who do need help in terms of potentially living longer, which is fantastic, but it's questionable on the quality of life that they have and the costs of care, etc. And you're trying to keep everybody happy, and that's tough. I can say that from a personal perspective. You know that families are default, you'll go to the ends of the earth to help them. We don't all live cheek by jowl as we used to. So, you know, the commitment to help, it was always there. It's an unwritten rule, isn't it, with family? But actually, it's not as easy to just pop round these days as it would have been 30 or 40 years ago. So that commitment, I believe, for most families is there, in terms from a time perspective. But it's the financial education, again, about making grandparents and parents aware about what the opportunities are before it's too late. Because if you've got cognitive slowdown, which happens to all of us as Croatia, but might be accelerated through your 70s and 80s, then you are reliant on your children or your attorneys to make strong, robust financial decisions. It's easier to do that early in the process and potentially move property early in the process when emotionally you are robust enough to cope with it. The risk is you move too early, though, as well. But I think that's less of a risk than moving too late, in as it were, staying in the castle. When and you might find that the children are still staying with you in the castle because the wealth is not cascading down to the next generations as it should.